Lieutenant Sarah Chen had always been different from other kids growing up in small-town Nebraska. While her friends played with dolls, she built model airplanes. While they dreamed of becoming teachers or nurses, she stared at the sky, watching jets leave white trails across the endless blue expanse above the cornfields. Her father, a Vietnam veteran, had been skeptical when she first announced her intention to become a fighter pilot. "The military's changing, sweetheart," he'd said, "but some doors are still pretty heavy to push open." Her mother worried about the dangers, but Sarah's determination never wavered. She knew what she wanted from the age of 12, and nothing would stop her from reaching those clouds. The path hadn't been easy. At the Naval Academy, she faced instructors who questioned whether women belonged in combat aircraft. She endured comments from male classmates who suggested she was taking a spot away from someone more deserving. During flight training, she had to prove herself twice as hard as everyone else, executing every maneuver with precision that left no room for criticism. But Sarah thrived under pressure. She graduated top of her flight school class and earned her wings flying FA-18 Super Hornets off aircraft carriers. For 3 years, she'd flown combat missions over hostile territory, leading strike formations and earning the respect of her squadron mates. Her call sign, Phoenix, came after she successfully landed a heavily damaged aircraft on a carrier deck during a storm, saving not just her own life but preventing the loss of a $60 million fighter. Now, at 28, she found herself in a briefing room at Naval Air Station North Island, wondering why she'd been summoned here with no explanation. The message had been simple. "Report to Building 847, Room 201, 0800 hours. Dress whites required." She'd asked her commanding officer what it was about, but he just shrugged and said orders were orders. The room was filled with an unusual mix of personnel. She recognized some faces from around the base, but others were completely unfamiliar. There were Navy pilots like herself, some Marines she didn't know, and several men in desert camouflage uniforms who carried themselves with a particular bearing that suggested special operations. They all sat in uncomfortable plastic chairs arranged in neat rows, everyone wondering what brought this diverse group together. At exactly 8 o'clock, the door opened and 3 men entered. The first was an admiral Sarah recognized from base ceremonies. The second was a colonel in marine dress blues she'd never seen before. The third man made everyone in the room sit up straighter. Captain Marcus "Razor" Rodriguez was legendary in special operations circles. He stood about 6 feet tall with graying hair at his temples and scars that told stories he'd never share publicly. His seal trident gleamed on his chest above rows of ribbons that represented deployments to every major conflict zone of the past 15 years. When he looked at the assembled group, his dark eyes seemed to evaluate each person individually in the span of seconds. "Ladies and gentlemen," the admiral began, "what you're about to hear is classified at the highest levels. Before we continue, everyone must sign the non-disclosure agreements being distributed now." Sailors moved through the rows, handing out thick packets of legal documents. Sarah read through hers carefully. The language was serious and sobering, with references to national security and severe legal consequences for unauthorized disclosure. She signed her name with a slight tremor in her hand, suddenly aware that her life was about to change dramatically. Captain Rodriguez stepped forward once all the documents were collected. His voice was deep and measured with just a hint of a Texas accent. 3 weeks ago, intelligence sources confirmed that a high-value target is being held at a compound in the mountains of Afghanistan. This individual has information critical to preventing a terrorist attack on American soil. He clicked a remote, and satellite images appeared on the screen behind him. The compound looked like a fortress carved into the mountainside, surrounded by natural barriers and defensive positions. "The problem is location and access. The target is being held in a facility that's essentially unreachable by conventional assault methods. It's too high for helicopters to insert troops effectively due to altitude and weather conditions. The terrain makes ground approach impossible without being detected days in advance, and the anti-aircraft systems surrounding the area rule out standard air support. Sarah studied the images, her tactical mind already working through the challenges. The compound sat on a narrow ridge at over 12,000 feet elevation, surrounded by peaks that would create severe wind patterns and unpredictable air currents. The approaches were limited and well defended. This mission requires a unique combination of skills, Rodriguez continued. We need the precision flying capabilities of our best fighter pilots, the tactical expertise of special operations forces, and the courage to attempt something that's never been tried before in combat. The Marine colonel stepped forward. The operation will involve a small team of SEALs inserting via an unconventional method, securing the target, and extracting under hostile conditions. The window of opportunity is extremely narrow, and the margin for error is essentially zero. Sarah's heart rate increased as she began to understand why she might be here. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to form a picture that was both terrifying and thrilling. The insertion method we're proposing, Rodriguez said, his eyes scanning the room, involves aerial deployment from fighter aircraft at high altitude and extreme speed. The team would need to be dropped with pinpoint accuracy onto a target zone approximately the size of a basketball court at night in mountain terrain with significant anti-aircraft threats in the surrounding area. Murmurs rippled through the room. Several of the Marines exchanged glances that suggested they understood the complexity of what was being proposed. The Navy pilots, including Sarah, were calculating the incredible precision such a mission would require. The political situation makes this operation extremely sensitive, the Admiral added. We cannot officially acknowledge any American military presence in this region. If the mission fails, if personnel are captured, if the operation is exposed, the diplomatic consequences could be severe. This is a volunteer-only mission with no official support if things go wrong. Rodriguez looked directly at the assembled pilots. I need flight crews capable of precision navigation in extreme conditions, flying low enough to avoid radar detection, but high enough to safely deploy personnel, with the skills to extract under hostile fire if necessary. The margin for error in navigation is measured in meters, not kilometers. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. She understood now why she was here. This wasn't just about flying skills, it was about precision under pressure that went beyond anything she'd experienced in conventional combat operations. The timeline is compressed, Rodriguez continued. Training begins tomorrow for those who volunteer. The mission launches in 2 weeks. I won't lie to you about the risks. The chances of everyone coming home safely are not what any of us would prefer, but the intelligence indicates that American lives depend on the success of this operation. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle over the room. I'm looking for volunteers who understand that some missions matter more than personal safety. This is one of those missions. His gaze moved methodically across the faces in the room. I need to know who's willing to risk everything for a mission that officially doesn't exist. The room fell completely silent. Sarah could hear the air conditioning humming and the distant sound of aircraft operations outside. Her mind raced through everything she'd just heard. This was the kind of mission that would either make careers or end them permanently. There would be no medals, no public recognition, no glory if they succeeded. But if they failed, people would die, and it would be their fault. Rodriguez's voice cut through the silence. Before anyone makes a decision, let me be more specific about what we're asking. The mission profile requires capabilities that exist at the intersection of different specialties. We need pilots who can fly precision formations in extreme conditions and navigate by landmarks in unfamiliar terrain at night. We need aircrew who can maintain situational awareness while managing complex aircraft systems under combat stress. He clicked the remote again, showing detailed topographical maps of the target area. But most critically, he continued. "We need someone who can fly a fighter aircraft low enough and slow enough to safely deploy personnel, while maintaining the ability to accelerate and climb rapidly to escape surface-to-air threats." The physics of this operation pushed the performance envelope of both aircraft and pilots beyond normal operational limits. Sarah studied the terrain maps with growing understanding. The mission would require flying through mountain valleys at night, using terrain masking to avoid detection, then executing a precision deployment at exactly the right moment and location. The margin for error was essentially zero. "The personal risks are significant," Rodriguez added. "If you're shot down, you're alone in hostile territory with no official support. If you're captured, the government will deny any knowledge of the operation. If the mission fails, you'll live with the knowledge that people died because of decisions you made in the cockpit." The weight of his words hung heavy in the room. This was beyond anything they'd trained for, beyond the scope of conventional military operations. This was the kind of mission that tested not just skills, but character. Rodriguez looked around the room one more time. "I need to know right now who's willing to take this on. The mission requires specific skills. But more than that, it requires people who understand that some things matter more than personal safety." His eyes moved across the pilots, systematically. "Any fighter pilots willing to volunteer for an operation that will test every skill you've ever learned, and some you haven't." The silence stretched out for what felt like hours, but was probably only 30 seconds. Sarah felt her heart pounding in her chest. This was the moment she'd trained for her entire career without knowing it. Everything she'd endured to get here, every challenge she'd overcome, every time she'd proved herself had led to this choice. She thought about her father's words about doors being heavy to push open. She thought about the comments from instructors who'd questioned whether women belonged in combat aircraft. She thought about the lives that hung in the balance and the unique skills this mission required. Without overthinking it, without calculating the personal costs, without considering the career implications, Sarah stood up. The room remained silent, but she could feel every eye turning toward her. Rodriguez's gaze fixed on her with an intensity that was both evaluating and approving. She didn't speak, didn't explain herself, didn't make any grand statements. She simply stood, shoulders back, looking directly at the SEAL captain who had asked the question. In that moment, everything changed. Not just for the mission, not just for the men in that room who had never seen a woman volunteer for something like this, but for Sarah herself. She had just stepped across a line that couldn't be uncrossed, into a world where the stakes were higher than anything she'd ever imagined. Rodriguez nodded slowly, a slight smile creasing the corners of his eyes. "Outstanding, Lieutenant. Anyone else?" 2 male pilots from her squadron stood up, followed by a Marine aviator she didn't recognize. But Sarah knew that her decision had broken the ice, that her willingness to volunteer had given others permission to do the same. As they began discussing the next steps, Sarah realized that her life had just taken a turn toward something extraordinary. She had no idea what lay ahead, but she knew with absolute certainty that this was where she belonged. The training began before dawn the next morning at a classified facility in the desert outside Las Vegas. Sarah arrived to find the 3 other pilots who had volunteered, along with 8 Navy SEALs she'd never seen before. The difference in their physical conditioning was immediately apparent. While the pilots were certainly fit by normal standards, the SEALs looked like they were carved from granite. Rodriguez addressed the combined group with characteristic directness. "For the next 2 weeks, you're going to learn to work together in ways that don't exist in any manual. Pilots, you're going to understand exactly what it takes to deploy and support Special Operations Forces. SEALs, you're going to learn what these aircraft can and cannot do, and how to work within those limitations." The first week was the most physically and mentally demanding period of Sarah's military career. The SEALs put all the pilots through a modified version of their training regimen. They ran miles through sand dunes before sunrise, practiced combat marksmanship until their hands cramped, and learned basic battlefield medical procedures until they could treat gunshot wounds blindfolded. But the real education came during the tactical planning sessions. Sarah found herself working directly with Master Chief Petty Officer David Bull Morrison, Rodriguez's second-in-command. Bull was a 15-year SEAL veteran with deployment experience in every major conflict zone. He stood about 5'9" but was built like a linebacker, with arms covered in tattoos that told the story of his service. "Lieutenant," Bull said during their first planning session, "I need you to understand something about insertion operations. When we go out that aircraft door, we're trusting you with our lives in a way that goes beyond normal pilot-passenger relationships." They were hunched over detailed topographical maps spread across a metal table in a windowless briefing room. The maps showed every ridge, every valley, every potential obstacle in the target area. The difference between landing in the right spot and being 50 meters off could mean the difference between mission success and all of us dying in enemy territory, Bull continued, his finger tracing the narrow target zone. "We need to land here," he pointed to a small clearing. "Not here." He pointed to a cliff face nearby. "And definitely not here." He indicated an area marked with red symbols representing known enemy positions. Sarah studied the maps with growing appreciation for the complexity involved. "What's the margin for error on the drop zone?" "About 20 meters in any direction," Bull replied, "which means your navigation has to be perfect, your air speed has to be exact, and your timing has to be precise to the second. Oh, and you'll be doing this at night in mountain terrain, with surface-to-air missiles looking for you." The technical challenges were staggering. Sarah spent hours working with the aircraft's navigation systems, learning to use terrain features for reference points when GPS might be unavailable or unreliable. She practiced flying formation with the other pilots, maintaining precise spacing while navigating through simulated mountain valleys at low altitude. The flight profiles they practiced were unlike anything in standard pilot training. They would approach the target area at high altitude to avoid detection, then descend rapidly through mountain passes, using the terrain to mask their approach. The critical phase came when they had to slow down and level out just long enough for the SEALs to deploy, then immediately accelerate and climb to escape before enemy air defenses could acquire them. "The hardest part," explained Lieutenant Commander Jake Hawk Wilson, the senior pilot on the team, "is transitioning from attack speed to deployment speed without losing control or alerting every anti-aircraft system in the area." They practiced the maneuvers repeatedly over the Nevada desert, using remote valleys that approximated the terrain they'd face. Sarah learned to read the landscape at night, identifying features by their shapes against the stars and using thermal imaging to spot potential threats. But the technical training was only part of the preparation. Rodriguez insisted that everyone understand the human stakes involved. "The target we're extracting," he explained during a classified briefing, "is Dr. Ahmed Hassan, a nuclear engineer who was kidnapped 6 months ago from a research facility in Pakistan. Intelligence sources indicate he's being forced to provide technical assistance for a terrorist organization attempting to build a dirty bomb." Rodriguez clicked through satellite images showing the compound where Hassan was being held. "Dr. Hassan managed to get one message out through intermediaries. The device they're building will be ready for deployment within 3 weeks. If they succeed in detonating it in an American city, the casualties could reach into the hundreds of thousands." The room fell silent as the full weight of their mission became clear. This wasn't just about rescuing one man. It was about preventing a catastrophic attack on American soil. "The compound is heavily defended," Rodriguez continued, "with approximately 40 militants, including experienced fighters who've been trained in anti-aircraft procedures. They're expecting some kind of rescue attempt, which means they'll be watching the skies." Sarah studied the intelligence photographs, noting the positions of anti-aircraft weapons and guard towers. The facility had been designed to be virtually impregnable from ground assault. but its position on a narrow mountain ridge created specific vulnerabilities that could be exploited by air insertion. The extraction window is extremely narrow, Rodriguez explained. Intelligence indicates that Hassan will be moved to a different location in exactly 2 weeks. If we miss this opportunity, we may never get another chance. During the second week of training, they practiced the actual mission profile repeatedly. Sarah and Hawk would fly a 2-ship formation, with Sarah's aircraft carrying 4 SEALs and Hawk's carrying the other 4. The approach would be made at night, flying low through valleys to avoid radar detection, then climbing rapidly to deployment altitude just before reaching the target. The technical precision required was extraordinary. Sarah had to maintain exact airspeed and altitude, while Hawk flew formation just meters away from her wingtip. The SEALs would deploy using modified parachute systems designed for high-altitude, low-opening operations in mountainous terrain. Remember, Bull explained during their final briefing, once we're on the ground, you need to be ready for immediate extraction. We'll have Hassan secured and ready for pickup in 20 minutes, or we won't have him at all. The enemy response will be immediate and overwhelming. The extraction procedure was even more challenging than insertion. Sarah would have to return to the same area, now alerted and hostile, and hover while the SEALs climbed aboard using fast rope techniques. All of this would happen while taking enemy fire and with limited fuel remaining. The whole operation depends on timing, Rodriguez emphasized. Every phase has to happen exactly when planned, or the mission fails. There's no backup plan because there's no time for one. Sarah found herself working 18-hour days, studying maps, practicing maneuvers, and running through emergency procedures until they became automatic responses. She learned to communicate with the SEAL team using their tactical language and understood their operational requirements in detail. But perhaps the most important part of her training came from informal conversations with the SEALs themselves. During meal breaks and equipment checks, she learned about their backgrounds, their families, their reasons for volunteering for such dangerous missions. "I've got 2 kids," Bull told her one evening as they reviewed extraction procedures. "My daughter's 8 and my son's 12. When I think about that dirty bomb going off in an American city, I think about their school, their friends, their future. That's why I'm here." Rodriguez shared his own perspective during a late-night planning session. "I've been doing this for 20 years, he said, and I've never seen intelligence this solid about a threat this immediate. Dr. Hassan is the key to stopping something that could kill more Americans than any terrorist attack in history." As the training progressed, Sarah noticed a change in how the SEALs related to her. Initially, there had been polite skepticism about whether a female pilot could handle the physical and mental demands of the mission. But as she proved her competence day after day, executing every maneuver with precision and staying calm under pressure, their attitude shifted to genuine respect. "Chen," Rodriguez said after a particularly difficult night training exercise, "you fly like you've been doing special operations your whole career. Where'd you learn to maintain formation in terrain like that?" Sarah smiled, exhausted but proud. "Same place you learned to jump out of perfectly good airplanes, Captain. Practice and pure stubbornness." The final night before deployment, Rodriguez gathered the entire team for one last briefing. The satellite images now showed increased activity around the compound, confirming that Hassan was still there but also indicating heightened security. "Intelligence reports suggest they know something's coming," Rodriguez said grimly. "They've doubled the guard shifts and moved additional anti-aircraft weapons into position. This is going to be harder than we planned." Sarah felt her stomach tighten as she studied the updated photographs. The number of surface-to-air missile sites had increased significantly, creating multiple threat zones that would have to be avoided during both insertion and extraction. "The weather forecast shows cloud cover moving in," Hawk added, "which will help conceal our approach, but make navigation more challenging." Rodriguez looked at each team member individually. I want everyone to understand that tomorrow night, we're attempting something that's never been done before under these conditions. The combination of terrain, altitude, enemy defenses, and weather makes this one of the most challenging operations any of us will ever face." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle over the group. "But I've trained with all of you for 2 weeks, and I know what you're capable of. Dr. Hassan is counting on us, and so are the people who'll die if we fail. We have one chance to get this right, and I believe we will." That night, Sarah lay in her bunk staring at the ceiling, running through every aspect of the mission in her mind. She thought about the precision required, the lives depending on her skills, and the knowledge that tomorrow night she would either prove herself capable of extraordinary things or fail spectacularly. She thought about her father's words about heavy doors and realized that she was about to find out just how much weight she could push. Tomorrow, she would discover whether all her training, all her determination, and all her courage were enough for a mission that would test every limit she'd ever imagined. The alarm would sound in 4 hours, beginning a day that would end with either triumph or tragedy. There was no middle ground, no partial success possible. Either they would bring Dr. Hassan home and prevent a terrorist attack that could kill hundreds of thousands of Americans, or they would fail and live with the consequences forever. As she finally drifted off to sleep, Sarah's last conscious thought was a promise to herself and to the men who were trusting her with their lives. Tomorrow night, she would be perfect. The mission launched at 0200 hours from a classified airbase in the Middle East. Sarah strapped into her FA-18 Super Hornet as ground crews performed final checks by red-filtered flashlights. The aircraft had been modified for the mission with additional navigation equipment and specialized deployment systems that had never been used in actual combat. Hawk's aircraft sat on the parallel taxiway, its engines already spinning up. In the passenger compartments of both fighters, 8 of the most elite warriors in the American military made final equipment checks. Sarah could hear Bull's voice through the intercom system, calm and professional, as he confirmed that his team was ready. "Phoenix, this is Razor," Rodriguez's voice came through her headset. "Remember, once we're over hostile territory, radio silence unless there's an emergency. We get one shot at this." Sarah keyed her mic. "Copy that, Razor. See you on the other side." The flight to the target area took 2 hours, following a carefully planned route that avoided known radar installations and air defense systems. Sarah flew in loose formation with Hawk, maintaining radio silence while monitoring multiple navigation systems and watching for any signs of enemy detection. As they approached the mountain range containing their target, the terrain became increasingly treacherous. Peaks rose to over 15,000 feet on either side of their flight path, creating wind currents that buffeted the aircraft unpredictably. Sarah had to constantly adjust power and trim to maintain precise altitude and airspeed. "Approaching initial point," Hawk transmitted on their encrypted frequency. "Beginning descent to attack altitude." Sarah followed Hawk down into the valleys, using terrain masking to avoid radar detection. Flying at night through mountains required absolute trust in instruments and navigation systems. One mistake in altitude or heading could send them into a mountain face with no time for recovery. The approach to the target required threading through a narrow valley that twisted between peaks like a snake. Sarah had memorized every turn, every altitude change, every landmark that would guide them to the correct position. Flying by instruments alone wasn't enough. She had to recognize terrain features in the darkness and adjust their course based on visual references. "Phoenix, Hawk, target valley in sight. Beginning final approach." Sarah could see the compound now, a cluster of lights perched on a narrow ridge surrounded by anti-aircraft positions. Intelligence had been accurate about the defenses. She counted at least 6 surface-to-air missile sites, positioned to cover all the obvious approach routes. But they weren't using an obvious approach route. Sarah pulled her aircraft into a steep climb that would take them over the ridge at high altitude, then execute a rapid descent on the backside that would put them in position for deployment while avoiding most of the missile sites. Razor, Phoenix, beginning deployment run. Copy, Phoenix. Team is ready for insertion. Sarah leveled off at exactly the altitude and airspeed required for deployment. Hawk maintained perfect formation spacing as they approached the drop zone. Sarah could feel the aircraft shudder slightly as the SEALs prepared to exit through the modified cargo hatch. 10 seconds, she announced. The timing had to be perfect. Too early, and the SEALs would miss the landing zone. Too late, and they'd overshoot into enemy territory with no chance of reaching Dr. Hassan. "Mark! Mark! Mark!" Sarah called as they passed over the designated release point. She felt the aircraft lighten as Bull's team deployed, their parachutes invisible in the darkness below. Hawk's team followed seconds later. 8 elite warriors were now falling toward a hostile mountain ridge, trusting that Sarah's navigation had been accurate enough to put them in the right place. "Deployment complete," Hawk reported. "All personnel away." Now came the hardest part. Sarah had to get her aircraft away from the target area without being detected, then wait in a holding pattern until the SEALs completed their mission. But as she began to climb away from the ridge, alarms sounded in her cockpit. "Missile launch! Missile launch!" Hawk's voice crackled through the radio. "SAM site bearing 270. Sarah saw the rocket motor signature climbing toward them from a previously undetected launcher. The surface-to-air missile was tracking toward Hawk's aircraft, which was slightly behind and below her position. Without hesitation, Sarah rolled her aircraft inverted and pulled into a diving turn that put her between the missile and Hawk's fighter. She deployed chaff and flares while maneuvering aggressively to present a more attractive target to the incoming weapon. "Phoenix, break off! That missile's tracking you now." Sarah continued her defensive maneuvers, using every technique she'd ever learned to defeat the incoming threat. The missile passed between the two aircraft and detonated its warhead, close enough that shrapnel damaged her right engine, but far enough away that both fighters survived. "Engine fire warning," Sarah reported calmly as she fought to control her aircraft. "Shutting down right engine and proceeding to holding area on single engine." The damage was manageable, but meant she would have reduced power available for the extraction phase. Sarah ran through emergency procedures while monitoring her remaining engine parameters and calculating fuel consumption rates. Meanwhile, on the ground, Rodriguez and his team were discovering that the intelligence about the compound's defenses had been incomplete. The facility was more heavily fortified than expected, with additional guards and obstacles that hadn't shown up in satellite imagery. "Phoenix Razor," Rodriguez's voice came through her earpiece 20 minutes after insertion. "We've got Hassan, but we're taking heavy fire. The extraction LZ is compromised. We need immediate pickup from alternate site Bravo." Sarah's heart rate spiked. Alternate Site Bravo was a secondary extraction point they'd identified during planning, but it was smaller, more difficult to access, and hadn't been cleared of obstacles. Landing there would require even more precision than the original plan. "Copy, Razor. Proceeding to alternate extraction site. What's your estimated time to reach Bravo?" 15 minutes if we're lucky. The whole place is lighting up. They know we're here and they're bringing everything they've got." Sarah turned toward the alternate extraction site, calculating approach angles and trying to determine if her damaged aircraft could manage the required maneuvers on a single engine. Hawk flew close formation beside her, ready to assist if needed. The alternate landing zone was located on an even narrower ridge, surrounded by peaks that created severe wind patterns. Approaching it would require flying through a canyon barely wider than her aircraft's wingspan, then executing a precise hover over rough terrain while the SEALs climbed aboard. "Phoenix, be advised we've got enemy helicopters launching from a base about 20 kilometers south of your position." came a warning from their intelligence support. 2 attack helicopters heading toward the extraction site. The situation was deteriorating rapidly. Sarah would have to reach the extraction point, hover long enough for the SEALs to board, and escape before enemy aircraft arrived. All of this on a damaged aircraft with reduced power and limited fuel. She began her approach to the canyon, using night vision systems to navigate between rock walls that seemed to close in around her aircraft. Flying through the narrow passage required absolute precision. Any deviation from the exact center line would result in wingtip strikes that would destroy the aircraft. "Hawk, you stay high and provide cover," Sarah transmitted. "If those enemy helicopters show up, we're going to need all the help we can get." As she emerged from the canyon, Sarah could see muzzle flashes in the darkness ahead. The SEALs were in a running firefight as they moved toward the extraction point, carrying Dr. Hassan between them while enemy forces closed in from multiple directions. "Razor, Phoenix, I'm in position for pickup. Where are you?" 200 meters out and moving fast. We've got wounded and Hassan is barely conscious. This needs to happen quickly." Sarah brought her aircraft into a hover over the designated spot, fighting crosswinds that threatened to push her into the mountain face. The damage to her right engine meant she had less power available for the precise control needed to maintain position in the difficult conditions. She could see tracers flying through the darkness below as the SEAL team fought their way to the extraction point. Enemy forces were converging on their position from 3 directions, and it was only a matter of minutes before they would be overwhelmed. "Contact! Contact!" Bull's voice came through the radio. "We're taking fire from the ridge line. Phoenix, can you provide suppression?" Sarah pivoted her aircraft and triggered her 20mm cannon, sending streams of fire toward the enemy positions Bull had indicated. The muzzle flashes from the ridge stopped temporarily as enemy fighters took cover. "Razor, you need to move now." "Those helicopters are 3 minutes out!" Rodriguez and his team appeared out of the darkness, half carrying Dr. Hassan between them. Bull had blood streaming down his face from a head wound, and 2 other SEALs were limping from leg injuries. But they moved with the disciplined urgency of professionals who understood that hesitation meant death. The extraction procedure they'd practiced dozens of times now had to be executed under combat conditions with wounded personnel and an unconscious civilian. Sarah held her aircraft in a precise hover while ropes dropped and the SEALs began climbing aboard. "Hurry, hurry, hurry!" she called as enemy fire intensified around them. Bullets pinged off her aircraft's armor as hostile forces realized what was happening and concentrated their fire on the helicopter. Hassan was pulled aboard first, unconscious but breathing. The wounded SEALs followed, moving with determination despite their injuries. Rodriguez came up last, covering the team's withdrawal with suppressive fire until he could grab the rope himself. "All personnel aboard," Bull reported. "Get us out of here." Sarah pulled pitch and climbed away from the ridge just as the enemy helicopters appeared on her radar. But her damaged aircraft was struggling to gain altitude with the additional weight of passengers and limited power from her remaining engine. "Phoenix, enemy helicopters are closing on your position," Hawk warned. "You need more altitude to clear the mountain pass." Sarah pushed her aircraft's limits, nursing every bit of performance from the damaged machine. The engine temperature was climbing toward red line values, but stopping to let it cool would mean certain destruction by the pursuing helicopters. "Phoenix, this is Hawk. I'm engaging the enemy aircraft. Continue your extraction." Sarah watched on her radar display as Hawk turned back toward the enemy helicopters, accepting a 2-against-1 engagement to buy her time to escape with the rescued personnel. The mountain pass ahead required precise navigation through a narrow gap between peaks. Sarah had to maintain enough altitude to clear the rocks while keeping her airspeed low enough to avoid overstressing her damaged engine. The margin for error was essentially 0. Behind them, the sounds of air-to-air combat echoed through the mountains as Hawk engaged the enemy helicopters with missiles and cannon fire. Sarah forced herself to focus on flying while trusting that her wingman could handle himself in combat. "Phoenix Hawk, splash 2 enemy helicopters. I'm joining up for the flight home." Relief flooded through Sarah as she cleared the mountain pass and began the long flight back to base. Dr. Hassan was alive, the SEAL team was safe despite their wounds, and they had prevented a terrorist attack that could have killed hundreds of thousands of Americans. But the real significance of what had happened wouldn't become clear until after they landed. When Sarah shut down her aircraft at the recovery base, she was met by the Admiral and several other senior officers she didn't recognize. Dr. Hassan was immediately whisked away by medical personnel and intelligence officers for debriefing. Rodriguez found her during the post-mission briefings, his face bandaged but his expression serious. "Chen," he said, "what you did back there, flying extraction under those conditions with a damaged aircraft, that was exceptional even by SEAL standards. But more than that, you proved something that's going to change how we think about these operations." Sarah looked at him curiously. "What do you mean, Captain?" "I mean that tonight, you became the first woman ever to successfully pilot a special operations extraction under hostile fire. You didn't just complete the mission, you demonstrated capabilities that are going to open doors that have been closed for decades." Over the following weeks, as intelligence analysts confirmed that they had indeed prevented a catastrophic terrorist attack, the significance of Sarah's participation began to reverberate through the highest levels of the Pentagon. The mission had been classified at the highest levels, but within the special operations community, word spread quickly about the female fighter pilot who had volunteered for an impossible mission and executed it flawlessly under the most challenging conditions imaginable. Rodriguez was promoted to Admiral and given command of a new joint special operations unit that would integrate conventional and special forces in ways that had never been attempted before. He specifically requested Sarah as one of his key personnel. "Lieutenant Chen," he said during her transfer interview, "what happened in that briefing room when you stood up changed everything. Not just because you volunteered, but because you proved that the future of special operations isn't about who traditionally does what jobs. It's about finding the best people for the mission, regardless of any other factors." Sarah's success led to the creation of new programs that integrated female pilots into special operations roles that had previously been closed to them. Her example inspired other women to volunteer for challenging assignments, and proved to skeptical commanders that capability mattered more than gender. Dr. Hassan's debriefing revealed details about terrorist networks that led to the prevention of multiple other attacks. The dirty bomb plot was completely dismantled, and dozens of terrorist operatives were captured using information he provided. But for Sarah, the most meaningful recognition came from Bull and the other SEALs who had trusted her with their lives. They presented her with a SEAL Trident pin, an honor rarely given to outsiders, with an inscription that read, "To Phoenix, you brought us home. Semper Fidelis." 3 years later, Sarah was promoted to commander and given her own squadron of pilots, training for joint special operations missions. She instituted new training programs that emphasized the kind of precision and teamwork she had learned working with Rodriguez's SEAL team. The briefing room where she had first stood up to volunteer was eventually renamed in honor of the mission, though the details remained classified. A simple plaque on the wall read, "Courage is not the absence of fear, but action in spite of it." Sarah often thought about that moment when Rodriguez had asked his question, and she had made the decision to stand up. She realized now that she hadn't just volunteered for a mission that night. She had volunteered to help rewrite the rules about what was possible. The doors her father had warned her about being heavy to push open had indeed been heavy, but once they were opened, they stayed open for others to follow. And that, Sarah realized, had always been the point. When young female pilots asked her for advice about pursuing challenging assignments, she always told them the same thing. When someone asks for volunteers for something that matters, stand up, Don't think about whether you're qualified or ready or whether others think you belong there. Just stand up. Everything else will work itself out. The mission had officially never happened. There were no medals, no public recognition, no records that could be shared outside classified channels. But Sarah knew that sometimes the most important victories are the ones that happen in silence, opening paths for others to follow. And late at night, when she looked up at the stars from the flight line, she remembered the moment when everything changed. Not when she proved herself in combat, but when she made the decision to try.